Hello, welcome again to the conversation series. My name is Marcus Rittenrook. I'm the Associate Director of the QUT Design Lab. I'm very pleased that you've joined us today for the conversation seminar series. I'll start with acknowledging of the traditional owners. QUT acknowledges the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nations owners of the land where QUT now stands. We pay respect to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits. We recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. QUT acknowledges the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community. And just briefly about the conversation seminar series, about the structure. So this is a monthly seminar series where we have both internal and external speakers. Sessions are so fairly short. We try to keep the presentation to 20 to 30 minutes, so we have a bit of time for Q&A, but it doesn't have to sort of fill up the whole hour. The whole idea is that we use the Zoom format and sort of try to keep it short and sweet. Sessions are recorded, and that's for internal use. The actual presentation might go public, but not the questions and answer session. If you would like to continue the discussion online, we very much encourage you to use the Design Lab Conversations channel on Slack. I know that might be sort of causing some level of dissonance for some people, sort of having the chat here and having the chat over somewhere else. The reason for that is that the chats that we use, the chat in Zoom is sort of ephemeral, it disappears after the meeting, but the chat in Slack is actually there and the discussion can continue. So see if you can find that. If not, just chat here and we'll put it into the channel. And otherwise, if you would like access to the recording on the slides, please email Shelley under QUT Design Lab Coordinator. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce Associate Professor Verena Thomas. We'll be talking about bridging community, academia, and policy spaces through use of arts-based methodologies. And just a very, very quick intro. So hopefully most of you know Verena anyway. Verena is a chief investigator with the QUT Design Lab. She holds a PhD in communications from UTS, and her research interests include communication and social change, communication for development, health communication, arts-based research approaches, visual methodologies, and participatory design. So without further ado, over to you, but sorry, just one more slide. Just a quick preview over the upcoming conversations seminars. So the next one off the rank is our Dr. Nick Kelly. We'll be talking about design framing. Then in September, we have Dr. Muge Beleg, who will be talking about her work. It's hardly yet to be determined. And the same with Dr. Jeremy Kerr on the 9th of October. We'll be talking about his Brave Arts project, and the title is yet to be determined. So over to you, Verena. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be able to share my research today. I'll start with also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where QUT stands. And I would also like to acknowledge any Pacific Islanders joining today, as I'll be presenting examples from the Pacific, in particular from Papua New Guinea. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague, Jackie Cowley, whom I work very closely with on all of the projects that I'll be presenting today. So, as the title suggests, as my bio said, a lot of my work is around arts-based and visual approaches, and I really like to focus on looking at working with communities today and how these approaches, the arts-based approaches, provide us with opportunities to work closely with communities, but also to impact policy spaces. And I'll reflect what that means for us academics and what that means for how we work within the academic system, in particular around non-traditional research outputs. I'll start off with a painting by Matthias Kawaga. Matthias Kawaga was one of the first contemporary artists in Papua New Guinea. And this is a painting from 1999 when he had the opportunity to meet the Queen. and traveled to England. He was working pre-independence in Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea gained independence in 1975. And so he was quite instrumental in shaping the contemporary art movement. And why I wanted to start off with this painting is because he offered, as an artist, a unique perspective onto the world. And he was able, through his artwork, to share his worldview with others. And that was both incredibly creative and innovative, but also political at the time. And one of the scholars, Uli Baya from the University of Papua New Guinea at the time, said that Kawaga was the inventor of his own tradition, meaning that he invented a style of art that continued within Papua New Guinea, and many, many artists took on. And it was, I think last year or the year before, that I walked into a Brisbane gallery and I saw this painting. And it tells the story of my great uncle, who was a missionary in Papua New Guinea. And I was quite struck to see an artist depict this story of my great uncle in a painting, and me seeing that in a Brisbane gallery. So I wanted to share this little introduction to also show how artworks connect worldviews, how they talk about relationships, and they share stories, and that when we do research, you know, we should find ways in tapping into the expressiveness and the creative nature of what the arts have to offer. And I know most of us in the creative industries do that. So in that sense, as Eisner states, work in the arts is not only a way of creating performances and products, it is a way of creating our lives by expanding our consciousness, shaping our disposition, satisfying our quest for meaning, establishing contact with others, and sharing a culture. And when it comes to arts-based approaches, and by that I mean any research approaches that use the arts in their investigation, as Knowles and Cole have highlighted, they are part of a broader commitment to shift the dominant paradigmatic view that keeps the academy and community separated. So acknowledging the multiple dimensions that constitute and form the human condition: physical, emotional, spiritual, social, and cultural, and the myriad ways of engaging in the world, oral, literal, visual, and embodied. That is to connect the work of the academy with the life and lives of communities through research that is accessible, evocative, embodied, empathetic, and provocative. So we all know that the academy has a focus on the written word, and often performance indicator that look at the individual, but the arts-based research approaches offers opportunities to look at the collective, to look at the senses, the way we engage in the world. And we all know that life is messy and complex, and so how can we use arts-based research approaches to strengthen our research? So before I go further into the topics that I'll be discussing today, I wanted to say that because the work is done in Papua New Guinea, it is very much framed by the concept of indigenous research approaches. And this is just to show a framework that was done by one of the master students I supervised when I was working in Papua New Guinea. And we had a number of postgraduate students mapping their own indigenous systems and knowledge systems, and they did that as part of their research project. But they all highlighted a common thread, which was the values were around respect, relationships, and reciprocity when engaging with communities. And so this was to guide this research process in community engagement at all times. We also found that working and collaborating with researchers from PNG and from Australia, that we were looking at using these frameworks in confident ways, but also being self-critical of our own engagement. And that in particular, this kind of framework helps in looking at contextualized engagement as well as valuing local knowledge systems. And today I wanted to talk about a couple of project examples, in particular around gender and violence in Papua New Guinea. One was on gender-based violence and the other related to sorcery accusation-related violence. The sorcery accusation, it means that it's been a contemporary issue where people in communities, in particular women, might be accused to be witches or sorcerers, and that violence that's related to that, and that is what we're seeking to address. And in particular, when talking about gender, there has been dominant media representation around women and violence. And I want to preface that we're really looking at the relational aspects of gender and how women are related. And in particular in the Pacific, this is quite important to look at the social relations when we're looking at addressing issues of violence. In particular, also looking at power and agencies and how people relate to their communities. When we've looked in our project at the media representation of violence, we often find that women are portrayed alone. They're often re-victimized, or there's potential for re-victimization through the media portrayal. We see extreme record of violence, and we've done a media analysis to look at sorcery accusation related violence and how it is represented. And we found that stories are mostly told from the perspective of police or government, but there's been very limited understanding from communities that perhaps have developed solutions, from people themselves, survivors, and in particular human rights defenders who have quite a strong profile in Papua New Guinea. And there have been several social movements to look at how issues around gender-based violence could be addressed. However, we found in our research that while they are reported on at times, their solutions and their local knowledge is often not presented. So just in terms of framing of these projects, to give this example, how we used arts-based approaches in our project, the framing was around how could we develop stronger communication strategies that would challenge the dominant representation, and how could we support human rights defenders with the creative tools to engage in conversations with communities, but also for advocacy with policymakers. And key to us was here to create ownership, participation, and value the local solutions. So just very briefly, our project was framed around action research and really looking at how we can use arts-based processes as research, at the same time build capacity. Then that would lead to further community engagement and advocacy. That then could also be monitored and create a space for shared learning. And at the core of this were partnerships with educational institutions, community-based partners, NGOs, and national organizations in PNG. Just briefly to say that we worked in 4 different provinces in Papua New Guinea, in Chimbu, Eastern Highlands, Bougainville, and Milne Bay. And that was important because Papua New Guinea has over 800 different languages and over 1,000 different cultural groups, that we at least would have a representation of 4 different regions within the research. And key to setting the work up was, of course, negotiating our relationships with the community-based partners and talking about our shared goals. So we found 4 community-based organizations that we worked with, and that was very much the key to the project being successful. Now, I wanted to give an example of a creative process that helped us to understand the nuances in around gender and violence related to gender, to show how arts-based processes can be used to elicit information and better understand context. So we used here an example activity, which is called Roll on the Wall, from process drama. Some of you might be familiar with this activity. And how it works is that we provide a scenario. In this case, it's Anna's story. And this is, Anna is a woman who is in an abusive relationship. And we work with community partners to look at what Anna is feeling. You see the figure on the right. And they post sticky notes inside of this figure to describe how Anna might be feeling. And they will also write on sticky notes perhaps what the community might be feeling about Anna, or what they are thinking about Anna. So we end up with a number of emotions and feelings that we can then look at together collectively. And we find, for example, in this activity, the barriers why Anna might not be accessing justice services, for example, in this case. This could be cultural barriers. For example, we discussed a lot around Pride Prize, that in this particular context, in the PNG Highlands, Pride Prize is paid, and therefore the woman is kind of lives on the land of the husband, and has moved to that place, and therefore is much more challenged to access services, and lacks the agency and the power to access legal services. So these are the kind of conversations that emerge. By doing that, we're tapping into collective knowledge. We are creating a safe space for people to engage because we're providing a story, a character-based story. We uncover tacit knowledge, and we start understanding local solutions as we take this discussion further. But it was also a crucial step for us to build trusting relationships with our community partners. So that is just an example of an activity that uses creative techniques, and many will be familiar with those with regards to co-design and process drama as well. One participant said that they learned from this workshop that many of them have been living with different forms of violence, but that they didn't know that from each other, and that they felt that through the workshop they could openly share problems. And in this case, the participants comment on the use of photo voice that helped them to understand their own situation, but also that of others. And speaking of photo voice, that was the next step in our project. So once we had collectively discussed some ideas, we started story circles, and we also involved photography to document stories, to develop digital stories. And what I wanted to highlight here is that often in our workshops, the analysis takes place within workshops, and it does so collectively. So as we are telling stories, we are highlighting the different themes, we are identifying which stories are reoccurring, and we fine-tune stories to see what is the collective story that people want to tell, but also the individual stories. And in this case of the project, we found that the stories identified causes. In this case, it was sorcery, accusation-related violence. They identified very strongly impacts, but also the local solutions. So these narratives allowed us then to map these. And I'm showing this slide only very briefly because there's a lot of information there, but I'm mainly highlighting this as a process of analysis that we went through in the narrative inquiry. So out of that then came stories that were complex, they addressed multiple issues, and we produced about 42 digital stories. And this stands in contrast to the existing media representation that was prior to engagement in this project, which did not necessarily engage in the underlying causes of sorcery accusations within communities, but also these stories provided 42 different solutions. Important here is that we work with human rights defenders, advocates that were already engaged in doing the community awareness, but where we worked with perhaps more vulnerable populations, we had the opportunity through metaphors and use of creative tools to ensure that stories were anonymous. Part of this process of reviewing the stories was also a feedback loop and discussing visual representation with partners. I'd like to share one of the stories now, so then I can discuss a little bit further how we moved it into the policy space after you perhaps have watched the story. This is a story I'll be showing is by Mary Kinney, and she's a human rights defender in the Highlands. It's about 5 minutes long. I hope the technology will work.
I'm Mary Kinney, me blog Kup LLG Karawagi Simbo Province. Me firstborn of family. Papa blomi Karen name give him go inside the Wambla brother Benway. To plan no got picking me, so me come up as the firstborn inside of family. Now me feel myself, me also got something inside the family. In 1978, Wambla trouble fight and been kirap namelo. Tupla warring clan. One got a man go, so probably must go. Come na Wambla time la no and decide lo come na Chicago one time mitla lo mama la house. Come down na big la rent kirap. Na then place them to tax them no got light. Pina hard to go back and sleep one time mitla la house Mary. No go house man. Time sleep and mama kirap lo 4 o'clock morning na subin kogo lo fire. Na subin kogo blo mitulo go lo school. Early 6 o'clock go finish lo fight. Na me go lo school. 3:30 me come back long. Let's me blast a come back la house na me looking mo some big la fire smoke kirap lo. Outside the mountain or line go fight them. La night blow mountain na mi blat savo some sample line and die. Then eventually body come la house line. Na mi been kirap no good of some pablo. All been killing mem na. Bagrabe mem go through. Na mi plan on ablo looking one bla remain blame lo. It's la time. Na me shock lo light lo me na me looking slack I'd way come lo bless him me no been a mas lo I will kill him last step probably. Inside lo sla time during lo cry or kirap na all walk him some la discuss and talk to him. Mama must give him go sleep louse maybe na go sem go na give him na go lo fight na sim bagara. So all been plain lo killing sla mama blo milo tok lo give him call cow. Talking kiss mama time. No been said I'm good louse tribe lo man blend but just go. How I'm going no talking me too. When by going no talk so just take off na go na. Me been think of saying but come back house but no come. Me wait one day pass. Then not a day come na go na wiki go na I'm go finish. Me feel him lost like I know some I was in the midst of, hey, me stop where, me by making one name. Me feel emptiness, life blow me. I get the properties blow me plan, or something just left behind one time will not land, only take over. Me black got them big black coffee garden ground. Or the resource where me enjoy him, let them just go same landlord not line. Now me been developing some like I'm sick inside of me, but me no say one can sick. Me been kissing like I'm sick now, and been stuck on time long time. Even me go to college still have been affecting me, so problem meeting was them. Online lo place mas bagara been you. So I've been trying to work in some like ritual lo bringing more families now, like talk out now, talk lo. What's me? So that all by awesome out him scene na talk na all by all right classic blooming. Now all this time you think him long like Christmas. It's like trauma and been stuff one time me. Just lately and me line him it was trauma. I'm not been like thinking with Papa been got lost and me kissing like kind sick blood place. So me realizing na me cancel na now it's the time me go through it's like work the human rights na it's like kind and me looks towards them all this time it was trauma in me that have been driving me go it's like sick na time me go plenty of several counseling na it's like I know it's like sick and go eventually I'm gonna now me stop nothing. Mutla mas work is something all narpla. Besides establish like I'm saying, heavy or semi blood been go through. So one blood blame me. Another blame was send Napla Susam, Angela, Napla, Agnes. The black will seem like similar stories, trouble fight related to sorcery. So me black working was like something he come now. Me black Rabin's organization in 1999. Now organization, I'm 18 years old, where people have been walked strong through law, down in slavery law, all forms of violence against them ordinary. And now people are in out in Slades, and Islands Women Human Rights Defenders Movement team leader, and all McKinney. Now me working I'm also now me play continue to support him ordinary, where only go inside ordinary or man or beginning or go inside like kind of similar situations now me feeling myself inside Blomian. Yet me feeling so. Yet me even go through so me myself be more large.
At this stage, we usually ask people whether they have any feedback or comments or any thoughts. If you do at this point, perhaps note down your questions or ideas, and then we can discuss it at the end of the presentation, perhaps, if that's okay. Yeah. And so this was a digital story by Mary, one of the human rights defenders. And the story has been used in multiple forms. And this was co-created, co-produced with Mary. And so these stories, so this is one of the 42 stories, have been used in communities to start the conversations about sorcery accusations, the impact, and to promote the human rights work that the advocates have been doing. And to the left here, you see one of the maps. This was from another project, but it highlights the way how we look at distribution networks locally in Papua New Guinea. So one of the key aspects is also to understand the communication ecologies, to understand how we might promote and use stories to start these conversations in communities. And you will see here in the PowerPoint is what's called a house pixar, a video house where people get together to watch things. And we use these spaces for advocacy. Another point, trying to get to the next slide. Another key aspect of the work
if you right click on the slide, you might be able to go next, Verena.
Yeah, thanks. That one worked. Another key component is that we actively look at together collectively how we can influence policy with these stories. And this is an example from the project we worked on gender-based violence, where we invited donors and policymakers, government, to a space at the national capital, Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, to present the stories, the local solutions that community-based organizations had developed. And this was quite instrumental in pushing the gender-based violence strategy at the time to be approved by government in Papua New Guinea. So it helped to bring the issue to the forefront, but there was also a demonstration that there were solutions within country available, and this was recognized by one of the executive directors of the Office for the Development of Women, who acknowledged that she wasn't aware that the solutions were right there, and there were many people working on those. So telling their stories also helped in pushing these policy agendas forward. And this is us discussing it with human rights defenders and then supporting these agendas. Mary also had the opportunity to come to QUT, where we had a photographic exhibition, and she presented also at the Women of the World Festival. And here she was tapping into the international networks to talk about the need to establish a human rights commission within Papua New Guinea. Again, another opportunity. And we have these stories online on our website as well, and are promoting this through these spaces. What happened as well is, and this moves towards now also the agenda of the project was to also challenge those dominant narratives, and we worked with journalists and provided training and shared workshops so that the representation of these stories moved away from the horrific nature of the crime towards positive stories. And the whole project was awarded an UN award for the work around GBV, and that was for the human rights defenders and the whole team. But it's an award that usually is awarded to journalists, and so that was interesting that that was being acknowledged in that way. And just to add, we also co-developed a toolkit for facilitators, and the toolkit uses these stories as well and has some participatory activities in it. So to say, from this project, To Me Stand Up Strong, we had digital stories as outputs, we had the photo exhibition, the toolkit, the website, and traditional research outputs, or papers and journal articles. But I want to emphasize, for us working with communities under the indigenous research frameworks, these traditional research outputs, they're more towards the end. Because the focus is on co-creation, co-development, and supporting the social agenda with communities. There are, of course, challenges within that too, and that was to maintain the community links in our work, and also in particular to support the vulnerable groups. We were lucky working with community-based partners who have a great network within communities and provide these support services. Without that, it would have been difficult to tell these stories and publicize them that widely. We also found that the work is very much process focused, and that's a very important component of this work. And that we found donors often liking the creative outputs and liking what they were achieving within communities, but that we very much focus on the process, and that then there's a need for greater understanding among institutions as the process, as a research process, but also one for healing, for engagement, for shared learning. There were challenges, I guess, how we support these processes within our legal and administrative systems, and in particular monitoring and evaluation frameworks. The human rights defenders monitored their own screenings and learned about how people perceive their stories. And one of the responses was very much people felt strong senses of empathy for people who had experienced those challenges. And then another challenge is how we manage perhaps these different priorities within an academic system, and how we facilitate the cross-cultural research, in particular around our accountability mechanisms towards community. So in terms of bridging, perhaps academia and community, what was core for us is to privilege community knowledge and community benefit in their agenda through relational and collective and creative outputs that perhaps would not have been possible with more traditional outputs. All the digital stories, for example, we acknowledge the authorship. They are authored by the storytellers and supported by our research team. And that's important to bring this knowledge into the academic space. So they are also captured on ePrints, for example, and they can be cited. For projects with social justice focus, these creative outputs can then be used to advocate in communities or with policymakers, again, bridging policy and community, and for us as academics being in that space to facilitate that process. The collection of monitoring and evaluation data was quite important to support reflection and also the practice, enabling reflection, but also peer review on the impact of these outputs. Integrated within that was a capacity building process where we looked at, for example, producing these outputs. Organizations were supplied with media kits. We had data analysis workshops. To aim to do most of this work collectively and output it collectively. And then again, we documented through the publication of traditional research outputs as well. That was my last slide. So yes, so I wanted to showcase this as an example. As we, or particularly my work, engages with community, and that is at the foreground of the work, and the impact and engagement is at the foreground. And the creative research outputs have enabled us to prioritize these, but also to have a mechanism within QUT to get these recognized. This is to maintain our relationship with community, but also foregrounding the benefit to community of this work. And I think that it bridges some of those links, either with community, but also with policymakers. And I'm really interested in hearing from others if they had similar experiences. And of course, I welcome questions and further discussions. And my colleague, Jackie Cowley, is also here. This work has been done collaboratively and of course with the team in Papua New Guinea as well. Thank you so much.